Hi there. This lecture is going to walk you through a brief introductory guide to the critical theories that we'll be using in this unit. There is not a lot of information on each particular critical theory. We will have separate lectures for all of them. This is just our introductory guide. Okay? So let's begin. What are critical theories? Sometimes you hear them referred to as critical lenses. They're just ways of helping us look at cultural artifacts, and by artifacts I mean lectures, stories, poems, music, propaganda posters, anything that the culture produces, in a particular way, and often in lots of particular ways, to give us different perspectives and help us understand more about the artifact. So some of the lenses we're going to talk about today as we apply it to Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour are the field of biography, cultural and historical studies, Marxism, sometimes called economic studies, feminist and gender studies, psychology, genre studies, and we'll look at it from archetypal and mythological perspectives. So let's get started. The Story of an Hour was written by Kate Chopin and published in 1894. And this is the example that we're going to be using throughout the lecture. A person who is interested in biography studies would tell us that we really can't understand a cultural work, in this instance, this short story, The Story of an Hour, unless we understand the biography of the author. So, who is Kate Chopin? Where did she live? Where did she grow up? What kind of family life did she have? All of those sorts of things a biography scholar would suggest would be influential in her writing, and we can't understand the story without understanding something about the artist herself. If we are interested in the time period that the author lives in, we're talking about historical studies and cultural studies. These are two closely related fields that we'll talk about in more detail. We'll tease them apart later. But in general, we're looking at what happened in the time period and the story was published. And two things, actually. What happened in in 1894 when it was published, and what happened in the time period of the story. Not necessarily the same thing. I can live in the 21st century and write a novel about characters who live in the 17th century. So it's important to understand not only the cultural times, society, historical events, etc. of the artist in the time period in which she's living, but also the time period in which the characters are living. So we would look at different techniques from the field of cultural and historical studies to understand the characters' actions. This is based both on time and location. Not all parts of the world are the same at every time period. Marxism, or economic studies, is interested in power related to economic situation. So who has the power in the marketplace? How do they gain it? How do they maintain it? We would argue that Louise Mallard can only act in certain ways based on her economic standing in society. Is she poor? Is she rich? Is she, middle income? All of those things factor into what she is and is not able to do. Feminist and gender studies, and that includes queer studies, transgender studies, all of those sorts of things as well, is sort of a large umbrella area of studies. Gender studies and queer studies used to be grouped with feminism, but now those fields pretty much have branched out on their own as well, because there's been enough interest in making them their own departments in colleges, and etc. But as you would expect, feminist scholars are interested in female characters, how they're treated by others, what are they able to do in the study, and as we go through, you're going to see that some of these overlap, right? If we're looking at female characters, much of what they can and cannot do is based on economic level and historical or cultural constraints. So these categories are not as clear cut. You can talk about biography when you're talking about feminism. You can talk about history when you talk about feminism, right? But the basic focus of your reading, if you're doing a feminist reading of a work, you're looking at mostly the female characters, how they act amongst themselves, how they're treated in society, how they're treated differently from the male characters. And then gender studies, what are people's roles in society, just based on gender, what they can and cannot do. And queer studies obviously looks at the larger category is for looking at homosexual characters and transgendered characters and various other supra-gendered kind of discussions, which may or may not fit in with Kate Chopin. We'll have to see when we do our reading of it. If I'm looking from a artifact, in this case our story of an hour, from a psychological perspective, I'm often applying theories from psychologists, famous ones like Freud and Maslow and Jung. We might be looking at the characters in terms of does a character represent the id, the ego, or the superego? Is there any kind of psychological trauma in any of the characters? Are there any kind of neuroses or mental illnesses that we have to take into account? Is a character schizophrenic? So these are the kind of things that would help us understand a work if we apply this particular critical lens. Genre studies, it's kind of an interesting, fun way of looking at a work. So, I put down here as my example of genres. Most of you are familiar with that word anyway. If you go to a bookstore, or you're downloading music, or going to Netflix, there are categories, right? You like certain kinds of music, certain kinds of books or films. I gave you just a tiny list of them: chick lit, horror, mystery, crime, science fiction, right? Those are all what we call genres. And each field has its own list of genres. So in fiction, we could have all those different categories: horror fiction, crime fiction, whatever. And we also have different types of writing, like short stories, plays, poetry. So we can look at Kate Chopin and talk about how it uses the conventions of a short story, and how it might include conventions from other types of writing as well. Or we can look at it in terms of, is it a romance? Is it a mystery novel? What genre does it fall under? And finally, we can look at archetypes and myths as they appear in the story of an hour. So Carl Jung is our big character, and Joseph Campbell for archetypal and mythological studies. So what we're looking at is symbols and culture. Every culture has symbols representing death, birth, renewal, all of these sorts of things. But every culture does presents those symbols in a different way. So, for example, I used here, every culture has is familiar with death, right? We can't really escape that. But how we present death, for instance, in most of Europe and in America, we see death as a grim reaper type of figure. In another culture, they may see death represented by a lizard or a coyote or a snake, right? So how we represent these big cultural icons is different, and those symbols find their way into literature and art and music. So a scholar in this field, is my example here, might look at Kate Chopin and see characters that are really influenced by fairy tale or by legend or by religion or by mythology. There are certain archetypal elements that we can look at, the kind of stock characters that we see over and over again, like the hero or the magic sword or those sorts of things. So those are the theories we're going to look at. We might look at eco-criticism as well if we have time, but that doesn't appear in this particular lecture. But in talking about theory and the artifact, in our case again the story, don't make the mistake of saying Kate Chopin or whatever other author you're writing about wrote a feminist story or wrote a Marxist story or a psychological story. They're not the ones interpreting their work. We're interpreting their work. We, the reader. We're the ones who are doing a psychological study or a Marxist examination. So it's inappropriate to say Kate Chopin wrote a Marxist story. She didn't do anything of the sort. That's just one of the lenses we're looking at the story through. So some things that you could say that are appropriate are, by examining the economic situation of the Mallards, it's evident that XYZ. Economic refers to Marxist, right? A reading of the story of the hour can form, I have no idea, I'll have to fix this, a typo, can benefit, that's the word I wanted in there. A reading of the story of an hour can benefit from a discussion of Freud's Oedipal complex. We're in the world of psychoanalytic theory there. A number of archetypes appear in Kate Chopin's story, so we're with myth and archetypal studies. Louise Mallard's role as a wife and sister are turned upside down, etc. And then we know we're in the area of gender studies or feminist scholarship. So I hope this is enough to get you started, and there'll be several other lectures on the individual critical lenses as well.